In honor of the Metroid franchise's official revival in its most recent remake, naturally titled Metroid: Samus Returns, I felt a good way to kick off this reviewing thing would be to look back at the original title that started this cult favorite series. A primary goal of mine is to look at various media series and see how they change going forward, and what better way to begin this particular niche than to look back at both the beginning of a franchise and also what its remake did to improve upon it years later. Note that I'll be diving into many of the aspects of both games, so a first spoiler warning for those who wish to experience either game blind. With that out of the way, let's dive into the beginnings to one of Nintendo's more beloved franchises. The plot of Metroid on the NES is a very clear one. Explore the planet Zebeth. Sorry, I'm going to mostly use the contemporary names as opposed to the initial ones given 3 decades ago. Explore the planet Zebeth's multi-layered labyrinths as bounty hunter Samus Aran in an attempt to defeat the evil space pirates' affiliated commanders Kraid and Ridley, then to destroy their leader, Mother Brain, the mechanical life vein, from exploiting a biological weapon of potentially galactic devastation, as the semi-poorly translated introduction screen states. It's simple, but a good enough reason to go explore a hostile alien world in search of power-ups. These upgrades are used to extend the main character's life energy and arsenal, all in preparation for the main 3 boss fights. As you explore, you'll increase Samus's missile count, as well as enhancing her main power beam with various effects. The original Metroid released in 1986 in Japan, while it hit Western shores on the Nintendo Entertainment System a year later and beyond. One of Metroid's unique features, especially when compared to other games of its time, is how non-linear and explorative it is for an 8-bit title. In contrast to most games focusing on primarily moving right, Metroid reinforces its different style of gameplay almost immediately by forcing you to go left for the iconic morphing ball sitting immediately next to the game's starting point. A tunnel too small for the bounty hunter Samus Aran to go through blocks initial progress down on the right anyway, and the only way to leave after obtaining the morph ball itself is by utilizing the new ability in classic Zelda fashion. Speaking of the protagonist, Samus Aran is notable for being one of the first leading ladies for the video game industry. A spoiler no more thanks in large part to Super Smash Bros., and especially this game's remake, which I'll address later in this video. Being referred to as a robot by many of my classmates in my schoolyard days, by those without the benefit of an instruction manual or knowledge of later appearances, it's kind of hard to consider the fact a spoiler these days. A part of me wishes I could have experienced that initial reveal as an endgame surprise, rather than as a game over screen in Super Metroid, my initial exposure to the series, but what can you do? The character is mostly a basic avatar in the original game anyway, as her identity as a woman was the game's original twist ending, but I'll address Samus more when I hit its remake. Gameplay is a hybrid of shooting and platforming. Coupled with its large branching paths, Metroid plays like a sandbox version of its sister game, Kid Icarus. By allowing the player to get as much or as little upgrades as possible in almost any order they choose, the game allows you to set your own pace, exploring Zebeth at your leisure, and not really directing you towards any objective beyond kill the game's 3 bosses. Thus the skeleton of the Metroidvania genre was conceived, not to be fully fleshed out until Metroid 3 on the Super Nintendo Entertainment System 8 years later. In truth, I don't believe the original NES game holds up very well, despite being a classic for its unique features from the mid-80s and iconic upgrades in music. Seriously, turning into a ball instead of crawling and having a deadly somersault move of energy known straight-faced as the screw attack is just gold, and fittingly helped make Metroid an historically significant game and a future cult and fan-favorite staple in Nintendo's catalog of franchises. Like its fantasy counterpart adventure series The Legend of Zelda, Metroid's sense of exploration and lack of much hand-holding made for a game that almost requires dedicated memorization or the usage of a hand-drawn map, that relish in letting the player just discover their secrets by simply following their curiosity. But if you had asked an alternate version of me, somehow born a decade earlier than I was, back in 1987, did you know Metroid would eventually become one of your favorite video game series? I don't think I would have believed you, to be honest. Like a ton of video games that eventually become successful franchises, it suffers from a bunch of little issues, many caused by the fact that it's an NES game from 1987. I know that it's almost petty of me to complain about that fact, But I do love this series, and I criticize it because I truly care about Metroid, and these things still bug me going back to this original game. I may be a fan of this series, but I'm not blind to its shortcomings. You may have noticed that I didn't actually mention the eponymous Metroids in the plot summary earlier on. In truth, if you didn't read the manual or had any prior knowledge of the series you're about to play, the game itself doesn't really deal with them until the final section of it. I do acknowledge that this is partially because text was something early NES games couldn't really splurge on, so you're often left to explore the game on your own instincts, be it from hints or outside assistance, to successfully progress through the game. This isn't really even a complaint or a nitpick as far as plot is concerned, simply an observation of how games of the 8-bit era mostly handled their stories. Much of it was in the manual, and a game largely relied on its gameplay. The problem arises in that the game is often a bit too vague and sneaky for its own good. Don't misunderstand me, the basic gameplay loop of exploring an alien world, running across various, often hostile, alien lifeforms to gather upgrades, feels good from a basic gameplay perspective. Growing from a fragile and weak bounty hunter into a beast of an agile tank armed to the teeth with missiles, and the one-hit kill that is often thanks to the screw attack, is the appeal that made this series so beloved. In future installments, that is. Here, the original game is somewhat handicapped by the technological limitations of its time, though I believe the game is still fun to play if you can acclimate to its specific rhythm. I have my problems with the game that hold it back from being one I truly replay often, but even this first one has the series' particular mix of large mazes consisting of vertical shafts and long tunnels, and it does feel like an alien planet as a result compared to other NES games of the mid-80s. While each area of Planet Zebes has both a unique color palette and background music, it doesn't take long to realize how confusing the layout can be when many of its hallways look so dang similar to each other. This is a game where I wouldn't begrudge anyone if they used a walkthrough or at least had a map of the game open in a tab on their computer or phone. Now, I know many hardcore fans of this series just balked at that bit of advice I gave, and I know full well the rebuttals that suggestion invites. By having a map pulled from, say, the internet, that fundamentally ruins the very exploration the game world presents you with. While I acknowledge that specific loss of the experience, the alternative, especially to newer players of the series, is often a lot of confusion that results in eventual frustration as the game often leads them down an apparent dead end. Here's a scenario made from observations I've seen from friends and family playing the original Metroid without much help. They often run into tunnels, wondering if they've been here before, since the color palette can remain the same for long stretches of time before finally changing color. They then hit an apparent dead end, only to turn around to possibly get lost in the very tunnels they came from, thanks to identically colored rooms. This says nothing about the series' somewhat dirty trick of breakable sections of wall that look identical to its surrounding geometry. These often have absolutely no indication that something is off beyond "you went all this way and have nothing to show for it," or when it straight up lies about transparent and invisible blocks that hide more tunnels and possible upgrades. For both those who are playing for fun or going for 100% completion, especially without any outside assistance, this presents a problem for gamers who are now used to some degree of guidance or direction. Metroid doesn't actually provide any instructions, controls, or context outside of its opening paragraph in the game. While it's true that many NES games relied largely on their gameplay and assumed the player would figure out certain things for themselves, it's now largely seen as poor form to not explain how certain aspects of your game works. My biggest example is how red doors take 5 missiles to open, while a player might only fire 1 or 2 and think they don't have the required weapon to progress through when the beam weapon alone didn't work thanks to the sound effects. How are newer players meant to divine that you need to hit it 5 times, especially early on when a player might only have 5 to 10 missiles and might not realize they need to use such a large amount of their current stash to progress? Confused or assuming they can't pass it at this time, they might then turn around to attempt to explore a different semi-copy-pasted corridor if they don't die from enemies who they haven't quite adapted to yet along the way. I love a few NES games dearly, but their rigid controls can often cause minor annoyances to me, as I'm used to more varied and smooth controls for later games. I know a common rebuttal is often, that's how games were made back then, they'd assume you try everything, and, the less common but more reductive, gamers these days only want hand-holding and can't explore on their own without a waypoint or glowing arrow. But Metroid is on the complete opposite end of the spectrum. I'm not against exploring a world with very little guidance, but Metroid is stacked against the average player's basic instincts, at least it did for friends and family playing the game for the first time. Heck, even I remember having difficulty adjusting to the game my first few times playing it, and I was already a fan of the series before I finally got around to playing the NES game for myself. Even though it was my 4th Metroid game and I already had an idea how a Metroid game worked, having red doors require 5 missiles to open instead of 1, as most of the later games require, had me, and no doubt many others, feel stumped and a bit thick from no fault of our own. I don't recall if I eventually looked up that it took multiple missiles in an instruction booklet, which do admittedly spell it out that it takes 5 missiles to open, or if I was frustrated and or bored and fired off enough to accidentally figure it out. Either way, it's an aspect of gaming that has thankfully been largely remedied due to text boxes and prompts being more clear than the 3rd generation of gaming. I do have to point out that being stumped on how to pass red blast shields is a very nitpicky complaint. I had played Super Metroid a few years before I touched the NES original, via the unlockable extra on the GameCube version of Metroid Prime. I did figure out at a younger age that those red doors also took 5 missiles in Super Metroid, but I didn't immediately recall that back in 2002, as I was also playing Metroid Fusion when I wasn't playing on the TV, and missile doors only required 1 missile in both Prime and Fusion. We had rented Super Metroid from Blockbuster years earlier when that was still a thing. Man, does that age me or what? So while many experienced or even curious gamers would attempt to fire their entire payload of missiles eventually, and it does seem obvious to any fan of this series now, thanks in large part to Super, I do bring this point up largely because both friends and family that played the NES original, and even Super Metroid to a lesser extent nowadays, tend to have no idea they need to fire off 5 missiles into the doors without me telling them to before they attempt to turn around and leave the room. Plus, most future Metroid games only require 1 missile to open red doors. I can't really fault the game on this one, because text was such a memory bottleneck, and it was the first game, but it's also not earning any points to me either. As a side note, it is nice that the virtual console releases of the games come with restore points that one can use and or abuse to brute force or save scum certain difficult sections of the game, should a player choose to do so. I myself am guilty of this at times for recording the very footage for this NES game, in a few sections where I completely drop the ball against certain enemies, and don't feel like getting a game over or grinding for more health. While a handy extra feature, I am judging the games based on their original merits, and the fact is, the game is a harsh and pretty difficult one at times, but luckily the internet and the digital manuals the games come with help alleviate some of this obtuseness. What I can fault the game on are those aforementioned invisible and breakable sections of the environment. While this is now a series staple, I never minded it as much in future games from Super on because they were either telegraphed more clearly or were often visually off in some way. These were often in the form of differently done textures in a room, a dead end that hides a power-up, or where more unexplored rooms on the map encouraged further exploration. Either way, the original Metroid doesn't have this luxury, and the player is somehow expected to shoot different sections of walls, bomb every inch of the floor, or to simply jump and roll against every identical wall, floor, and ceiling in hopes of finding a hidden area. It's similar to the Zelda thing when you begin to poke walls in hopes of finding a bombable section after seeing it once in a dungeon. You then begin to poke your sword in cardinal directions, hoping to hear the hollow clanging sound effect that reveals a secret. This is also similar when you begin to burn every bush in the overworld when you learn that some hide caves. I appreciate secrets, but there's a pretty distinct cutoff point, for me at least, where something is too vague for its own good. Many of the secrets in Metroid are kind of cheating, as their locations are virtually indistinguishable from the environment, or are simply not hinted at properly, instead of being naturally intuitive to the player. Though admittedly this section right here is telegraphed well enough to anyone with a gamer sense for secrets, that does actually pay off, but being a copy-pasted room still kind of hurts it a bit. I'm also one of those nutters who likes to collect things and try for 100% completion if I like a game or simply feel like proving myself. This admittedly self-imposed quirk of mine can drive me nuts in a game like this, hence why I don't really chastise newer players when they want at least a map for an older game like Metroid or The Legend of Zelda. In addition to basic design issues I have with the game, Metroid also doesn't earn favor with me, mainly due to an innate problem with the combat. Many of the enemies simply are difficult to hit, mainly because a large amount of aliens on Zebes are half Samus's height and are difficult and or harder to defeat. Samus cannot crouch, or crawl, and thus cannot easily defeat early crawling enemies or flying enemies that dive bomb towards her feet. Only being able to fire left, right, and up severely limits how good Metroid can feel to play if an enemy isn't immediately above you or matches your height. While you can use bombs to actually harm these enemies, it's troublesome and is an unnecessary step to defeating otherwise simple encounters that you're almost better off avoiding them if you aren't hurting for energy or missiles. Add to the fact that you begin the game with only 30 energy out of an initial 99, the game is explicitly out to get the player by stacking the deck against them in this way. Also, the screw attack often stops working when you approach the ground, so I accumulated much more unnecessary damage from trying to be clever this way. Nitpick in the grand scheme, but I had to vent about this. These complaints are directly tied to why I greatly prefer the Game Boy Advance remake to the NES original, but I'll return to that soon. I am one of those people who likes to start at the beginning of a series, be it in any form of entertainment. A game, film, television show, or book. I often begin at their first installment, in large part because I enjoy watching how it compares to later installments. I find it fascinating to see if a piece of entertainment improved, regressed, changed, adapted, or just seeing how the general public and fans reacted to its similarities and changes. By their very nature, video games are closely tied to the technology and platform they're released on. This unique element of interactive media serves as an excellent time capsule of technology, and insight into how various developers worked around the strengths and limitations of an era and platform, in this case pertaining to the NES in the mid-80s. The level of freedom and scale offered in Metroid is something I greatly admire it for, even when I can see that it came at the cost of being a bit obscure in the gameplay department. It may seem like I'm really down on the original Metroid, but even at its most basic, the game does succeed at presenting a great feeling of power growth that the best in its genre it helped pioneer excel at. While this distinctive Metroid style of gameplay wouldn't truly be conceived for almost another decade, the seeds of it are evident here. It's something I'm glad was allowed to be expanded upon, particularly in how Super Metroid would later set the standard in 8 years. So much so that it heavily influenced the original Metroid's remake years later. Metroid Zero Mission is, in my eyes, a perfect example on how to remake a game by improving on many of the original shortcomings and at the same time taking the opportunity of better hardware to add various features based on the improvements to its formula from its later installments. Released for the Game Boy Advance in 2004, Zero Mission takes the advancements of Metroids 3 and 4, 1994's Super Metroid and 2002's Metroid Fusion respectively, and applies their gameplay and design in reimagining the original game with both the future and past in mind. The game now boasts enough memory for basic cutscenes, both in-game and through stylized art, alongside more text to help further expand upon the basic premise and plot of the original Metroid. Many Metroid fans believe that less is more when it comes to the series, and not for unjustifiable reasons. Zero Mission strikes enough of a balance that I don't believe it intrudes on the excellent gameplay or atmosphere the series' best entries are known for. With brief bits of narration used in the beginning and towards the ending of the game, Zero Mission clearly establishes the plot. Go to planet Zebes to exterminate the deadly Metroid organisms and defeat the mechanical life form, Mother Brain. It's basically the same story, but expanded to actually mention the Metroids and give some more insight into Samus Aran herself. Metroid has always had good lore, but most of their in-game stories are simple and straightforward. They're pretty much at their best when relying on some of the best examples of atmosphere in gaming through music, lack of dialogue, and clear usage of color. It was also the first series I played to so effectively use environmental storytelling, an aspect I greatly admire when done well in both story-driven and especially gameplay-focused games. Zero Mission puts more emphasis on the Chozo, the series' resident space bird hippies, and their role in Samus Aran's upbringing. It's mostly told in quick cutscene flashbacks and environmental details, but it serves as a decent in-universe explanation for all the compatible upgrades for a Chozo-made power suit that are littered around Zebes' natural mazes. The power suit is a modified Chozo exoskeleton, presumably made to match their warriors, and is modular, so it easily works for gameplay and building up Samus into a one-woman army. Being able to clearly see Zebes in various colors and with a more diverse set of wildlife environments also helps tremendously with the ever-important immersion Metroid is known for. The graphics in general are a major step up, a bit obvious when a game is remade 18 years later, moving from an 8-bit system to a 32-bit handheld, but the NES era of gaming is one generation that almost universally benefits from remakes and spiritual successors. While 8-bit sprites have a ton of nostalgia tied to them, due in large part to Nintendo's influence in classic games, I do prefer the clearer 18-bit styled sprite work that Zero Mission beautifully presents itself with here. The art style of later and more modern Metroid games have leaned more towards a bright Western comic book aesthetic, with heavy shadows, bright colors against dark backgrounds, and distinctive shapes. Being inspired heavily by the Alien film franchise has worked in the favor of the series' presentation, as it's worked well enough as a baseline to help it eventually discover its identity among gaming as a whole. Metroid is one of Nintendo's darker IPs, largely focusing on isolation, more hostile enemies with more monster and sci-fi designs, with later entries containing brief moments of horror, and an actual timeline with clear story beats and developments in most of its games. Being one of their more difficult franchises in general definitely helps make Metroid distinguishable among the more colorful, cheerful, and newcomer-friendly series Nintendo is more known for. The soundtrack also saw a boost in Zero Mission, even with the Game Boy Advance's infamous sound chip deficiencies. The original's 8-bit tunes were moody enough to become fan favorites, particularly immortalized in Super Smash Bros., and are still a joy to listen to today. They're expanded upon nicely in Zero Mission, with many more added tunes to complement the additions to the remake. Beyond the presentation, it's the gameplay that received the largest boon. As I noted earlier, nothing will ever frustrate me more in the first Metroid game than not being able to simply crouch down to hit low enemies. I also miss the ability from later games to aim diagonally, and both these things are included in the remake, instantly elevating Zero Mission as the better game as far as I'm concerned. It further modernized, with enough now basic quality of life improvements that make it a much more balanced and complete game. The less I mention the archaic and glacial password system, the better, as Zero Mission now saves your progress with the added now series staple save rooms. Admittedly, the Virtual Console versions of Metroid do offer restore points that can help mitigate game overs, but save rooms are more convenient and are a better game design overall. I prefer the obvious and simple save rooms compared to restarting the player from the beginning of the game, with low health, every time you get a game over, or when you continue from a password. In addition to proper level design and a more varied visual palette, including the ever-helpful in-game map is a godsend here. Alongside areas that remain visually distinct and varied from each other, a player is highly unlikely to ever get lost thanks to repetitive and long similar corridors. While the game more blatantly directs the player with waypoints via Chozo statues this time around, it's never bothered me enough to completely condemn the feature. Even though I agree they aren't as necessary in Zero Mission, given how more clear-cut it is for a player to deduce where to go if they explore the world alongside the map. At the very least, it ensures that a player will never not know where they should be going early on in the game, and it may help ease them into how Metroid progression works. It may tell you where to go, but it's largely still up to the player to utilize all of Samus's abilities to shoot and bomb suspicious areas that seem to be an unlikely barren dead end. The improvements to the presentation help make the various areas of Zebes even more distinct and varied in Zero Mission. The rocky caverns of Brinstar, the volcanic Norfair, the forgotten fortress of Kraid, the hellish depths of Ridley's Lair, the industrial laboratory of Turian, all are wonderfully recreated and expanded upon from the original sparsely detailed caves of Black Voids. The remake even includes more areas, both returning and new, to help more closely connect the game to its later sequel, Super Metroid, with the addition of the surface area Crateria and a hint at the location of the wrecked ship. More additions continue with the return of earlier/later series staples, such as the Speed Booster and its devilish use of spine sharking to reach the trickiest upgrades, the Space Jump and the Screw Attack to aid in exploration, and including the Power Bombs as an endgame item to help fully explore Zebes, should the itch for 100% completion need to be scratched with less frustration. Some of those pickups are really nasty and hidden in the sneakiest of places, or require precise use of shine sparking. That earlier spine shark was intentional, by the way, as that's how I initially read the term years ago, because apparently I couldn't read. I feel little shame in showcasing one of the trickier examples here, because I always forget this one instance where you need to use a particular quirk with how the morph ball handles shine sparking on angled ground. Zero Mission in general also has some pretty hardcore sections for a handful of upgrades that require a certain degree of high-level play. Fair warning if you want 100% completion. If you dislike or aren't great at shine sparking, you're going to really dislike a few of these pickups. The original Metroid required the defeat of 2 dragon-like bosses in order to face the 3rd and final boss, and that remains true in the remake. Both have areas of Zebes named after them, and are infinitely more difficult for me in the original game compared to Zero Mission. Shout out to Crate for having an amazingly atmospheric theme for a wingless subterranean dragon. The more popular Ridley retroactively uses his own fan-favorite theme in the remake, and is the more relevant of the Space Pirate commanders to the lore. In a moment that would eventually cause painful ramifications in one particular future game, Zero Mission doesn't actually elaborate in-game that Ridley is the one responsible for orphaning a young Samus Aran. The attack on the space colony she lived on would eventually lead to her future as a bounty hunter, trained and enhanced genetically and physically by the Chozo. Again, Metroid is heavy on lore, but much of it is omitted from or is faintly hinted at in the games themselves. Both bosses are the same size as Samus in the original game, and are much more difficult for it. Bombarding her with claws and fireballs respectively, it requires quick reflexes and careful aiming if you don't simply tank a majority of the damage with your own energy tanks and go for broke with a barrage of missiles. Both foes are larger and more intimidating in Zero Mission, but a bigger target is the inevitable trade-off for the player. Kraid takes more timing and precise shots with a light mix of platforming in the later half of the encounter. I appreciate the mid-game challenge, and it is satisfying to overcome, even when my haste often causes unnecessary damage. On the other hand, I typically spend the 30-second encounter with Ridley pumping super missiles into that smug space dragon's face after the initial fireball attack. While his hitbox is more forgiving and is much easier for such a late-stage boss fight, as a fan, this is a different sort of satisfying. That satisfying feeling of overwhelming power hours later is one that most Metroid games reward the player with towards the end. Before the final descent into Turian to face Mother Brain, I should mention that Zero Mission adds plenty of additional mini-bosses that not only serve to heighten the game's varied fights, but also insert the extra abilities added from Super and Fusion naturally into the remake. These extras are more than welcome to me, for the game is still actually shorter than one might think given all the additions. While it expands upon the NES game quite a bit when listed on paper, like most of the series, its tight level design and snappy pace can be cleared in a dedicated play session. This is especially true for those familiar with the game, or have played any later Metroid installment. We'd only gotten 5 Metroid games by Zero Mission's 2004 release date, and arguably 10 mainline titles by this video's publishing date, including the newest remake, 2017's Samus Returns on the Nintendo 3DS. Even including spin-offs, collections, and remakes, that's roughly one Metroid release every 2 years during its current 31 years. While that's impressive sounding when lumping up the generous average as such, Metroid is one of those Nintendo franchises that has a bad habit of going into hibernation for large parts of a decade. Zero Mission was released during the first half of its prime resurgence, between 2002 and 2010. If you exclude the more recent 3DS spin-off, 2016's co-op focused Federation Force, there have been long 8 and 7-year spans of no Metroid games during the majority of the 90s and 2010s respectively. The point of that previous interlude was that Metroid games are honestly few and far between when compared to other popular and critically acclaimed Nintendo properties. While the games are shorter than most other genres, Metroid is often so tightly designed and a joy to play that I always gladly take an excellent 5 to 10 hour game that doesn't overstay its welcome, compared to some 20+ hour experiences that I've had to endure. While I agree that Zero Mission is a bit short even by Metroid standards, the quality more than makes up for its most glaring shortcoming in my eyes. Returning to the endgame, defeating both Kraid and Ridley unlocks the path to the final area of Zebes, and the main base of the Space Pirates, Turian. The titular Metroids finally make their debut as space jellyfish that latch on and directly drain the life energy out of various life forms, Made more obvious in Zero Mission in both cutscenes and environmental previews, the Metroid's main weakness of the Ice Beam missile combo is apparent and easily exploitable with quick enough reflexes. Being attacked by a Metroid is usually enough to freak out first-time players, and escape using the Morph Ball bombs may not be apparent in the initial freakout. I certainly remember my first time encountering them, and it was a great treat. While most Metroid games stack the various power beam effects, usually ice, wave, and plasma, the player usually doesn't need to worry once they receive an upgrade. In the original game, however, Samus must swap between the ice and wave beams, making Turian a much more difficult challenge if you never received the ice beam or switched it out later in the game. While you can purposefully ignore the ice beam here if you're mad, big props to anyone who has attempted that particular challenge. Also, the Zebesian space pirates don't actually appear in the original game. Anyway, the research area and command center are protected by Metroids and energy donuts, something that never ceases to annoy me to no end every time I approach Mother Brain's chamber. It makes me a nervous wreck, and I suppose that's as nice a backhanded compliment I'm going to give the area. It takes missiles and timing to reach her, and even more patience and skill to defeat the telepathic brain/organic supercomputer. Once you fire enough ammunition into her singular eye, the requisite self-destruct sequence initiates, and Samus must exit the facility up a vertical shaft to the planet's surface. This is where the NES version ends, and grades you on your performance based on your playtime. It results in a possible reveal of Samus in various states of undress if you were quick enough. Zero Mission expands on this by adding an extra scenario after the self-destruct sequence, where stripped down to her now iconic Zero suit, Samus must infiltrate the space pirate mothership armed with only her paralyzer pistol. The added area also connects to another new area, the Tresodia Ruins, which turns the segment into a stealth section that seems to have the fanbase split. I personally enjoyed the section and added challenge of not being caught and being unable to instantly kill or damage foes, but I understand that many dislike stealth sections in otherwise action-filled games. I'm probably definitely making excuses for this section of the game, but it personally makes it all the sweeter for me once you face the Ruins test and gain access to her fully powered suit. It's functionally the gravity suit from later games, and features Samus' traditional iconic appearance with the bulky shoulder pad design, while also equipping previously unusable abilities that were discovered earlier in the game. The resulting power trip allows players to track down the added power bombs in the mothership and take revenge against most space pirates and virtually every regular foe. Once Samus faces the actual final boss in the form of the Ridley robot and triggers the final countdown, she escapes in a space pirate fighter and the game ends. This again rewards you with one of several illustrations of Samus, depending on completion time, percentage of pickups gathered, and taking your difficulty setting into account. If it wasn't obvious by now, I believe that Metroid Zero Mission is the definitive version of the game, and the one I have and will continue to recommend to new players to the series. I don't think that the NES original is completely without merit though, and I do recommend it with the caveat that the curious go in knowing what to expect of 8-bit games of the time. I also don't feel bad possibly recommending a map if one gets frustrated with the original game's inherent design. It's worth the look if one doesn't believe me from this review, or simply wants to experience it for themselves, how far Metroid has come since 1986, but I'd still point everyone towards Zero Mission. In fact, completing the GBA remake unlocks the NES version as an additional bonus, even on the Wii U's Virtual Console release. So even more reason I recommend that you track down a copy of Zero Mission to play both versions of the title. Ideally, the game will re-emerge somehow on the Nintendo Switch. I know Nintendo often gets a lot of curious flack for perpetually re-releasing their past games on future systems, but I for one appreciate that they acknowledge their history. They do a pretty good job of making sure a majority of their games are available to current gamers, both returning and especially new players who may have never played these games, made before their time, or simply weren't aware of them before. Regardless, I know many statistically do not have access to a Wii U for its eShop, or can easily find a Game Boy Advance or the cartridge for Zero Mission itself, but the game is a worthy remake that completely makes the original obsolete in the best ways possible. By combining the spirit of the original game with the advancements of later ones, Metroid Zero Mission gets my highest recommendation as the perfect introduction to a cult fan favorite franchise. Thanks for watching if you stuck around this long. This was meant to go up nearly 2 weeks ago, but I wasn't quite satisfied with the initial script for this review, and I wanted to make a better first impression. It didn't help that I was also sidetracked a bit with my copy of Metroid Samus Returns. Balancing the last week, getting this first review done, and wishing to avoid any spoilers for the new remake really had me busy. This was a double feature too, so playing both the NES and GBA games back to back really hyped me up for Samus Returns, and put me in a great Metroid mood in general. I hope this review was insightful and or not a waste of time. I really enjoy talking about these sort of things with my friends and family in general, and I figured maybe it would be appreciated on the internet if it helps generate discussions. I'm not a super great speedrunner of Metroid games, but I do love that the series is officially back, with both a side-scroller now and an upcoming Metroid Prime 4. I really can't wait for that one. I should also probably mention that my real name is Jimmy, since my screen name of Gaz Knight of Nilrak is something I like too much to really change for this. Thanks for watching, here's for Metroid waking from hibernation again, and I'll see you guys next video.